Hi everybody, welcome, welcome. Here we are, a new workshop. I've got some really good things to share with you. I think so. I'm biased, but I hope they're good. I hope you find them of benefit. This workshop is called the Silence of Mindfulness. We'll get started in just about 2 minutes, right? So this is your 2-minute warning. So get yourself comfortable, get a beverage close by, whatever you need to make yourself comfortable. We will be doing a couple of meditations as always, so you can prepare for that. Preparing for this workshop was good for me. It was good for my personal practice. It kind of added a depth to my practice that I think I've been missing or been craving. So I can't wait to share some of these practices on silence, the silence of mindfulness. We'll get started in just about 1 more minute. So get yourself ready, get yourself landed in the session, close the door, maybe even lock the door. Tell everyone you're busy for the next hour, whatever it is. And I'll get started in just about 1 more minute. Sorry, did I swallow it? I see like a shadow right there on my nose. Do you see that? When I lean down, there's a shadow right there. I don't know. Just can't look at yourself too much on the screen. You start to go, what's that? What's that? What's that? Right? Alrighty, so it looks like we're coming up on the hour. It is time to get things rolling, get things started. I'm just going to take a breath just to kind of center myself, focus the mind. You can take a breath with me. And then here we are. Welcome everybody, welcome to today's session. It's called The Silence of Mindfulness, and I'm Michelle Duvall. So I want to start things off with just a little bit of silence. So keeping your eyes open, I just want you to begin to just kind of listen, hearing whatever it is that you're hearing. Noticing the sound of my voice at times, the sound of other things when I'm not speaking. So maybe noticing how silence really isn't all that silent after all. Maybe you can hear traffic or the wind in the trees, or maybe you can hear your own breath. Sometimes we can even sometimes hear our own ears, right? If you have any kind of tinnitus. So I want you to notice, how does it feel to just be sitting here now in relative silence? How does it feel? Does it make you restless or relaxed? Do you like it or not like it? So we're just kind of noticing, what is our relationship toward being in silence? How do we feel about it? How does it make us feel? the longer I hold the silence, maybe our relationship starts to change. Like at first we liked it, but now we're starting to feel restless or ready to get on with things or something else. So we're just kind of noticing overall what it feels like to be here together in a kind of silence. Okay, so now I'm going to break the silence. So it's not just our imagination. There is more sound, more noise overall in the world today coming from humanity than there ever was before. There are more cars, more helicopters, more buzzing drones, or more TVs and pinging gadgets, right? Our phones going off all the time. There is more sound now coming from humanity than ever before in history. So one of the ways we can know this is by looking at how loud emergency vehicles have to be nowadays, right? So an ambulance siren has to be loud enough to cut through all the surrounding sounds. So the decibels of emergency vehicle sirens are a really good measure of the loudness of our overall landscape, our overall world. And so today's sirens are estimated to be 6 times louder than they were 100 years ago. 6 times louder. So this shows us that our population centers are vastly louder now than they were before. And according to the National Park Service's Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division, I'd never even heard of such a division of the National Park Service. So it's a division called the Natural Sounds and Night Skies Division. According to them, noise pollution has been doubling to tripling about every 3 decades. So noise pollution has been doubling to tripling just about every 3 decades. So this overall, what I call like a wall of noise, is getting louder in our lives overall. And generally speaking, the more noise a person experiences over which they have no control, the more general stress they're apt to feel. So it's different from like cranking up your radio, listening to loud music. I love listening to loud music, but that's not what we're talking about. It's when the noise we didn't choose is happening. We didn't choose to have the noise, we can't control it, and we can't get away from it. That kind of noise will generally create this kind of a background stress for us. It's a kind of stimulation that if we can't control, it can very easily turn into a negative form of stimulation or even overstimulation, right? So this increase in noise is in general raising our collective baseline of stress. When you encounter a lot of noise over which you have little to no control to turn off or to separate yourself from, it's a kind of stimulant to our central nervous system and not necessarily in a positive way. The word noise actually comes from a Latin root meaning queasiness or pain. So when I was preparing for this workshop, someone somewhere in my neighborhood had some kind of a machine running. And it was just this constant buzz sound in my neighborhood for a few hours. And though in and of itself it wasn't that unpleasant of a sound, just the fact that I couldn't turn it off and that I couldn't get away from it, I could feel that in my body and in my mind. And to be honest, it made me feel like a little trapped, right? So it didn't feel particularly positive. And maybe you can relate to that. So Florence Nightingale once wrote that unnecessary noise is the cruel absence of care. Unnecessary noise is the cruel absence of care. And this is actually supported as well by science. So the body excretes stress hormones like adrenaline and cortisol into our bloodstream when we experience stress. And these hormones, in essence, change the overall composition of our blood, right? Which then causes our blood vessels to change in response. So when we have higher levels of these stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol, in our blood vessels tend to get stiffer. So they stiffen up to deal with the actual additional adrenaline and cortisol in the bloodstream. And what noise researchers have discovered is that this stiffening of our blood vessels can happen to us after a single night of uncontrollable noise exposure. So again, the kind of noise that we have no control over, or that we didn't choose to be a part of, or that we can't get away from. So it's not like going to a rock concert, right? That's by choice. After one night of exposure to uncontrollable noise, the researchers saw very clear evidence that almost everyone experienced stress from this, as shown in the stiffening of their blood vessels. We can also see correlations between high blood pressure and chronic noise sources like living close to highways and airports. Research also links noise to increased rates of things like sleep loss, heart disease, even, and tinnitus, right, which is that constant ringing in the ears. In fact, this is the very research that prompted the coining of the term noise pollution, right? So giving us that sense that chronic noise does have implications beyond just being a nuisance or something unpleasant in the moment. Just like pollution, it can have lasting and longer reaching effects. So I found this next bit of research really interesting because a lot of the research is on what sound and noise does to us. And this bit of research actually came from a father-son duo who were researching the effects of music on people. But what they discovered, mostly by accident, is that the silence between the music actually created the most profound effects in the participants. So the researchers would play a piece of music for the participant, and then they'd allow for about 2 minutes of silence between the music tracks. And they were measuring how much music impacted both a person's arousal level, like when they were listening to higher energy music, they were measuring how aroused that person got. And they were also measuring how relaxed a person got listening to relaxing music. But what they discovered, mostly by accident, is that the 2 minutes of silence actually created the strongest relaxation effect of them all, of everything. The participants moved more deeply into relaxed states when they were listening to silence as compared to when they were listening to even the most relaxing music. Another researcher by the name of Imke Kirstay, who was a professor at Duke University Medical School, she also stumbled on some surprising effects of silence, when what she had actually set out to research was the effect of sounds. So she was studying the effects of sound on the brains of mice and whether or not sound could influence the brain's ability to grow new nerve cells, right? So one of the ways the brain heals itself is by regeneration. So the brain can literally grow new nerve cells. It's called neurogenesis. And there are conditions that can help stimulate this ability to regenerate, to grow new nerve cells in the brain. And there are conditions such as stress, poor nutrition, and lack of exercise, which can limit and reduce this ability to grow new nerve cells. So in this particular research, they exposed 4 groups of mice to various auditory stimuli. So they used music, they used the sounds of baby mice, they used white noise, and then they also used silence just as like part of the control, right? So what do you play between the sounds? Well, you don't play anything, so it's silent. And their hypothesis, the researchers' hypothesis going into this experiment, was that the sounds of the baby mice that they played would create the best conditions for the growth of new brain cells. That was the hypothesis of the researchers. They thought that when the mice heard the sounds of baby mice, that would stimulate the growth of new brain cells. And then as it turned out, even though all of the sounds did create short-term neurological effects, not one of the sounds that they played had a lasting impact on the brain, except for the silence. When the mice were exposed to 2 hours of silence, that prompted cell development in the hippocampus, which is the region of the brain primarily related to the formation of memory. So the absence of input in regards to sound had a more pronounced effect on neural regeneration in the brains of these mice. Now, the growth of new brain cells doesn't always have health benefits, right? Because it's a big noisy truck going by. So the growth of new brain cells doesn't always have health benefits, because a lot of times those new brain cells either don't survive or they don't develop and integrate into the larger neural system. But in this case, Kirsty, the researcher, says that these cells that were stimulated in their growth by the silence actually did become functioning neurons. She said, and I quote, "We saw that silence is really what helped the newly generated cells to differentiate into neurons and then to integrate into the system." She then goes on to say that, and I quote, "Functional imaging studies indicate that trying to hear in silence activates the auditory cortex of the brain, and that trying to hear in silence can accelerate demonstrably the growth of valuable new brain cells." So, now, something new has been introduced, and it's important to us mindfulness practitioners. So when the mice were exposed to silence, the researchers discovered that the auditory cortex of the brain, the auditory cortex, was actually highly stimulated. So that meant that the mice were actually listening quite intently to the silence. So if you think about it, total silence is probably pretty rare out in nature, right? So the researchers hypothesized that the lack of sound was so unusual to the mice that it caused them to really listen, to really pay attention. So now what we're talking about isn't just being in silence, right? We can sit in a silent room and be thinking so intently about the argument we just had with our spouse that we're not really even aware of the silence at all. So that's not what we're talking about here, just being in silence. It's the act of listening actively to the silence, stimulating that auditory cortex in the brain that then creates the effect of neurogenesis. So it's the paying attention to the silence or to the quiet with that active and intentional piece. That's what creates the alchemy for the brain. Trying to hear in silence or listening to quiet. That's been proven to promote the growth of valuable new brain cells. They also discovered that listening deeply in a relatively quiet environment can actually create for us what we can call positive stress. So the term for positive stress is actually eustress. Eustress. It's spelled eustress, eustress. That's the term that describes positive stress, or what I tend to call positive stimulation. So eustress is the kind of stimulation that's needed for things like motivation, learning new things, getting out of bed in the morning kind of hyped up for a performance or a presentation. So eustress gets you up and motivated and gets your brain activated in a really positive, focused way. So everyday stress, or what we typically think of as just stress, right? Negative stress, actually undermines the growth and healing of the brain. While this kind of eustress or positive stress, or what I call positive stimulation, creates the kind of neural activation or brain energy that's needed for the growth and sustenance of new neurons. That's so amazing. So it's that active piece, the active listening piece, choosing to pay attention to the silence that creates it. So, you want to grow some new neurons together? Totally. So wait, one more thing I want to share, and then we'll do a meditation that's designed around just this, listening to silence, actively paying attention to quiet, so we can potentially create the good conditions for neurogenesis, right? But I want to share one more thing, and then we'll do it, and we'll meditate. So the definition of silence is the absence of sound. That's a definition of silence, the absence of sound, which under normal everyday circumstances is like really hard to find, right? It's almost impossible. I mean, even things like a breeze through the bushes makes sound, right? So sometimes people get irritated or feel like these kind of practices aren't accessible to them because their neighborhood is noisy, right? Like I live really close to a pretty busy street, and all day long, every day, I can hear the traffic. So more than needing our environment to be perfectly silent, we can get the same benefits from actively listening to quiet, right? So we can expand our understanding of silence to include quiet. So less sound than, say, being at a roller derby, right? And yes, if you're always in noise, like you work at a hospital and then you go home to a busy family life, lots of kids running around, then yeah, it might be harder for you to easily access the conditions for quiet. But now, after learning all of this about how good it is for our brains, right, you might start to think about making it more of a priority to actually seek quiet out and to make it for yourself if and when it's possible. So my family and I just went on a little trip for this past spring break. And you know, there's like a million options to choose from as far as where to go, amusement parks or to see family or whatever it is, go to the beach. Well, for this particular spring break, we chose to go to a national park. We went to the Joshua Tree National Park for this very reason, to get ourselves out and get our kids out in some real good old-fashioned quiet. We camped. We hiked around the Joshua Tree. We went out in the middle of nowhere. So I had been craving this kind of quiet. Sometimes we're craving something. Our bodies are telling us something, are telling us that we need something, but we don't always know what it is, right? So I want to encourage all of you here today to maybe begin to explore quiet and silence as something that maybe your brain needs for the growth and sustenance of new neurons, right? So growing new neurons is one of the ways that our brains heal. We get hurt, we hit our heads, or we get traumatized, or we experience consistent lack of sleep, or we overconsume alcohol or sugar. All of these things hurt the brain. We know this. And so then if we want to stay healthy or come back to health, we need to create the conditions to help our brains heal by creating the conditions that are optimal for the growth and sustenance of new neurons. And one of these conditions can not only be putting ourselves in silence or in quiet, but then actively engaging or listening to the quiet as best we can. So we're going to do that now. I'm going to show you how to use your mindfulness practice to engage with silence or to engage with quiet. Okay, so let's get ready to meditate. So one of the first truths about mindfulness practice is that we don't always have to hold our bodies in stillness for practice, right? So to start things off, I want you just to start to move and stretch a little bit, releasing any tension in the body with some movement, some stretch. And right while you're doing this, right while you're moving around, stretching the body, I want you to begin to listen. So this isn't something that we commonly do. We don't commonly move and stretch and actively begin to listen. So I want you to try that now. So maybe rolling through the back or the shoulders or the neck. And while you're doing this, you're listening. And then at some point, we're going to start to settle the body. So maybe just starting to slow your movements down as the body begins to settle. And as you slow your movements down, I want you to see if you can start to listen even more closely, even more intently as you slow the body down. And then at some point, finding a way of sitting so that your body can become more or less quiet. And as we do this, we're still listening. And at first, all we really notice are sounds, right? So I can hear the sound of an airplane, the sound of traffic. So at first, all we really hear are sounds within the quiet, right? So that's where we can begin, just listening to sounds. And now I want want you to see if you can begin to notice any space between the sounds. Like, so you hear a sound and then maybe there's a pause before you hear another sound. So just seeing if you can notice any space between the sounds. And seeing if you can stay out of judgments as you do this. So judgments like, no, there's too much noise, or I can't hear any space between the sounds. Instead, just stay with hearing. Just stay with hearing, putting all of your attention on this practice of active listening, hearing the space between the sounds. So we hear sounds, and we're also seeing if we can hear the quiet as well. So the quiet is the space that the sounds are arising within. So it's like with the sky is the space that the clouds arise within. The quiet is the space that the sounds arise within. Can you practice hearing that quiet, hearing that space from within which the sounds are arising? It's like hearing open space or hearing the sky. So really listening for the quiet space, the sounds are arising within. So not attaching to one sound or another. Instead, seeing if you can hear the space from within which the sounds are arising. So letting your body relax, letting your face go soft, and just opening and listening. Listening less to the sounds themselves and more to the space from which they arise. Hearing the quiet. Listening to the silence, if you can. Just about one more minute, just seeing if you can listen intently to the space beyond the sounds. And then we can begin to soften our focus, beginning to move and stretch a little bit, however feels good. And just opening your eyes when you're ready. So in our language, we depict different kinds of quiet, different kinds of silence. So for example, there's city silence as compared to country silence. There's something called conversational silence, where you don't just automatically say the next thing that pops into your head, so you hold some silence in conversation. There's something called situational silence, wherein you're silent, but just in certain situations. So maybe at like work meetings or around strangers. There's something called radio silence, right? When someone you're used to hearing from suddenly stops communicating. Now it's also called ghosting. There's pregnant silence, there's awkward silence. Sometimes we even say that there can be tremendous power in silence. So it can just be kind of interesting to reflect on these different types of silence and to acknowledge that they can mean different things in our lives. So now listen to this. In a way, silence always exists beyond the sounds or between the sounds. So silence can be understood as the space from within which sounds arise. So think about that for a moment. It's what we just practiced, but now I want us to reflect on it a little bit. So silence is the space from within which sounds arise. So just like clouds arise in the space of sky, right? Sounds arise in the space of silence. We don't commonly think of it like that, but it can be really useful for us as meditators to understand it this way for two main reasons. One is that this understanding of silence as being the space from within which sound arises, like the sky is the space from within which clouds arise. So this understanding of silence can help get us out of judgment. It is so easy in meditation like these to slip into judging the quality of our quiet or the quality of our silence. And then any sound that just naturally arises while we're meditating can seem to disturb it, right? To ruin it. And then we automatically have a problem. But when we understand quiet and silence as always being there as space, as the container from within which sounds arise, it lets us feel kind of like less crowded or less constricted or irritated or judgmental when invariably sounds arise in our environment, right? So it helps get us out of judging our quiet or our silence. And the second reason that this understanding of silence as the space that's always there beyond the sounds or between the sounds, the second reason that this can be really useful for us is that then we'll actually really try to hear it because we know it's there. You have to listen really closely to hear the silence behind or beyond the sounds. So when we practice in this way, really paying as close attention as possible to listening, this kind of practice invites us into the cultivation of really a deeper level of awareness or of the cultivation of a more subtle or more refined awareness. It invites us into what we can call close listening. And to do so, you have to release any preconceptions about what silence and quiet actually are. Otherwise, you won't even try because you'll think, well, there's just too much sound in my environment. There is no silence. So if you don't even think something is there, why would you try to notice it? You wouldn't. So then this ends the exploration or it ends the practice. When we can hold open the door on silence, knowing that it's always here, beyond the sounds, it's the space from within which sounds arise, then we can actually practice hearing it. It's there. Or should I say, it's here. It just takes a more subtle awareness to notice it. So when my father was teaching mindfulness like 30 some years ago, he used to have what he called a laundry list of how to understand the present. So he had a few different ways of describing or of answering the question, what is the present? And one of the ways he would describe it was that the present is the space between our thoughts. That's one way of understanding the present, as the space between our thoughts. Another way to understand the same concept is to understand the present as the space from within which our thoughts arise, or the space from within which really anything arises. So the only time you can ever have a thought is in the present moment. The thought is arising in your mind while you're having it in the present. The content of our thoughts is always about one of two things. The content of our thoughts is always either about the past or the future. That's what the content of our thoughts is about. But where the thoughts arise, the space is here in the present. It's the space from within which thoughts arise. It's the space from within which anything and everything arises. My father used to call the present the space between our thoughts, because most people only know a constant stream of thoughts. Most of us, without any kind of training, just experience this kind of like constant wall of thoughts, this wall of narration that accompanies everything we do. We are constantly narrating our life experience in our thoughts. It's one of the ways that we make sense of our world, right? By bringing the worlds into our minds in order to process it, by thinking about it. But then when we shift our attention from what we're thinking about to, say, the feeling of the breath, for just that micro mini millisecond that we're able to hold our attention just fully on that feeling of breath, we're in the present. And then because the mind can't be in two places at once, that movement of mind into the present is like opening up a little bit of space between all of those thoughts, because the mind can't be both fully present feeling our breath, for example, and often thought at the same time. So it like opens up a little bit of space in that wall of thoughts, opens up a little chink in the wall of thoughts. So this is akin to us shifting our attention from the clouds in the sky, right? So we're looking at the clouds in the sky, or we're looking at the content of the sky, and then we shift our attention to the sky itself, to the space. The sky itself is just space, right? So we see the color blue, but what we're actually looking at is space. And so in the realm of listening, it's like us shifting our attention from the individual sounds, like the cars or the television or whatever it is. So it's like shifting our attention from the individual sounds themselves and from our labels or our thoughts about those sounds, shifting our attention from all of that to the space or to the quiet from which or from within which the sounds are arising. So we can understand it like this. Do this with me for a moment. I want you to look around right now at the space that you're in. All right, so you're just kind of looking around at the space you're in. So you probably see a lot of objects, right? So lamps, plants, pencils, a desk, a window frame. You're seeing a lot of objects in your space, right? Now I want you to see if you can notice the space between the objects. So see if you can notice now the space within which these objects exist. right? There's a shift there. So that's how we can understand and then practice listening to quiet or listening to silence within the context of our mindfulness practice. So no matter where we are, we can practice shifting our attention from the individual sounds themselves to the sound of the space they're arising within. Now, obviously, if you're at like a rock and roll concert, it's going to be really hard to hear the space or to hear the silence. But if you're in a room meditating, even if there's constant sounds of traffic or voices in the next room, or your house settling, or the air conditioner or heater coming on and off, even if there are those sounds, we can still practice listening to the space the sounds are arising within. But we have to listen really closely. We have to really pay attention, waking up our brain, our auditory cortex, right? That's the component that helps to stimulate the brain. It's that real active engagement piece of things. It's the form of real intentional listening so that you can hear something besides or beyond just the noise and the sounds. So let's try it again. Now that we know what we're doing, let's meditate again. Okay, so let's start this particular practice with our eyes open. This can be a real skillful way to do this. So starting with our eyes open, I want you to first just move into awareness of what you see. So the present moment experience of what you're seeing. And again, probably the easiest things to see are the objects, right? So that's where we begin. Begin with what's easiest or most familiar, noticing the objects. And now again, I want you just to shift your attention to the space between the objects. You can totally do this, right? Sometimes it's not so much what you're seeing, because you can't really see the space, but you can notice it, you can sense it there. So don't analyze it too much. Analyzing causes problems. You just do it. And now I want you to close your eyes. And again, noticing what's easiest to notice. It's probably sounds. So first we're just going to notice the sounds. Listen to the sounds. You might even notice yourself labeling the sound. That's a car, that's a bird. Those are the thoughts about the sounds, right? Now, without thinking too much about it, I want you just to see if you can shift your attention from the sounds to the space. The space between the sounds or the space beyond the sounds. So you can't think too much about this. If you start thinking like, I can't listen to space, or there's too many sounds in my environment, I can't hear the space. If you listen to those thoughts, then you're no longer listening to the space. So then you can't. Listening to those thoughts of, I can't listen to space, will necessarily make you not be able to listen to space. So don't listen to the thoughts, listen to the quiet, to the silence, to the space from within which the sounds are arising and disappearing. So it's like paying attention to a space beyond thought, a space beyond sound, a space beyond cloud. It's like we're listening to the present. We're hearing presence, present moment. The space from within which everything arises and falls. The present. Can you hear that? Just listen. Okay, we can, excuse me, go ahead and open our eyes. So some people are able to kind of understand this experientially right away. Other people, it takes a little bit of practice. So to listen to the space between the sounds, to be able to see the space between the objects, to be able to experience the sky beyond just the clouds. It's really about being able to connect and pay attention to some of the more subtle aspects of existence, right? Being able to notice and pay attention to that which is not easily seen. That's one of the things that listening to silence in this way can help us to better understand and better connect with some of the more subtle aspects of existence. Usually, it's the loudest voices that get our attention. But we can train ourselves to hear the quieter ones as well. And then what happens when we do? Many people find that it opens up a new space for them, like a new place of being. So not just always stuck in the midst of all the hullabaloo. Even if the hullabaloo is still here and all around us, can we also notice the space from within which the hullabaloo is arising? And what happens to our minds and our brains when we do? On the level of mind, we discover another way of being in the world, another level of noticing. And on the level of brain, it gets to regenerate and to heal. So this is the invitation of practicing what I call the silence of mindfulness. I hope so much that these practices bring you benefit. I'll see you next time.